Welcome to URL Unzip, Reboot, and Leave, a podcast about the psychology that moves us. Through real conversations with thinkers, doers, and seekers, we explore how we adapt, evolve, and find meaning. So let's unzip, reboot, and leave. Today, our guest is Mark Darkworth. He is the co-director of the Center of Resilience and Inclusive Societies at Alfred Deakin Institute, Deakin University. He is a senior policy advisor. He spent his career shaping ideas around resilience, inclusion, and social trust. We will talk about racism, social cohesion, and its future. So, Mark, Center for Resilient and Inclusive Societies in Deakin University.
Yes.
Please explain the history of it, how it started, and what is the agenda behind these researches and stuff.
The Center for Resilient and Inclusive Societies is a consortium of six academic and community partners, which includes the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. And we have partners at Western Sydney University, Victoria University, the Australian Multicultural Foundation, and the Centre for Multicultural Youth. And it was established with a grant from the Victorian government as an independent think and do tank to research some of the tricky issues that societies faces them around social division, disadvantage, extremism, and discrimination. And one of the things that we focus on, in addition to doing this research, is coming up with some practical policy options that can be undertaken by government, by non-government organizations and communities in order to address some of these tricky issues.
Okay, all right. So this is funded by Victorian government, but you are working across nationally or
Yes,
just
we'll
for
be
Victoria?
working. We have partners in New South Wales and Victoria. Also get some other grant funding for specific projects as well.
Right. Okay. So, because this is like you are working on the social cohesion and all these racism, disengagement, polarization, all these things comes into picture. Can you please explain how social polarization and this disengagement happen?
Well, I think there are a number of complex issues as to what's actually happening. There's no single path or cause which makes an individual move towards um, extremism or disengagement. Um, Sometimes the path can appear to be deliberate and determined by personal agency, but it often unfolds in a number of things which are both very individual, but it's also connected to what's going on more broadly in society. I think that one of the things um, that often happens is a feeling that some individuals have, rightly or wrongly, of being alienated from or not belonging to mainstream society, a sense of being disconnected, ignored, or estranged, and they're attracted to various forms of extremist messaging, which appears to often quite deliberately appeal to that sense of grievance. And I think that's one of the key things that we focus a lot about, is that whatever form of extremism one's talking about is often underpinned by a sense of grievance against others in society, and that is sometimes fueled by a lack of trust in existing civic institutions. That's not in any way to excuse extremism. To seek to understand is not the same as seeking to excuse it, but I think it's important to understand these social determinants of people moving towards these extremist views.
Because I am an immigrant and what I see in the society, ethnicity, religion, culture, uh, which one of these, or maybe it's a complex thing, which one trigger more exclusivism?
Well, one of the things across the world that is often a characteristic of all forms of extremism is a sense of racial or religious exclusivism and the view that your particular view is the only world view or superior to other views. And one sees that this is one of the factors. And I think it's important to recognize that often people who are drawn um, to extremist views actually have more in common with each other even than they do with the broader community. I mean, there are a number of common predisposing factors, including a personal experience of real or perceived victimhood or a threat to one's in-group, a feeling of detachment or alienation from wider society, identification with a cause linked to a perceived victimized community, which may be either local or it may be geographically distant. Some of this is also linked to individuals seeking for and searching for a sense of purpose or a mission that creates a sense of belonging or attachment, and one in a strange way, um, the an extremist group may actually provide a sense of belonging to an in-group, which actually attracts people and can deal with some sort of personal feelings that may have. Um, there's sometimes people, connect with a group which has those they associate with the various people, which can lead to some sort of socialization into extremist views. And there's also, and I think one of the key things is that there's an ideological message that resonates with an individual's own experiences or pre-existing perceptions. It's often the case that the ideology, or however determined, is one of the factors that comes at the end rather than the beginning of the process. And we find um, that often those people who adopt extremist positions actually have a somewhat uh, uh, fragile or not particularly deep understanding of the ideology which they're purporting to push forward, because the reason they are drawn into it is often for emotional rather than ideological reasons.
And all these things typically happen in the marginalized, like clan or the marginalized people, and
And there
and
may be individuals
yes,
who, for various reasons, are feeling that they're not included in the broader society, and this may be a grievance that may be um, have some basis in their own lives, or it may have no basis at all. But people's own perceptions of themselves are the important aspect here.
right. So when this grievance or this like alienation translates into violence,
Mm.
okay, how government kind of take action to it, or I mean, I'm just trying to understand how long it takes. Like sometimes it's 1 year, 5 years, more than that per
Well,
problem.
I, I think one of the things important is that every individual's path is quite um, unique, and that some people may take a long time to move along a path. In some cases, um, it happens quickly. But the other thing is that the number of people who move from extremism to violent extremism in Australia is actually very small. Most people do not take a step of actually becoming violent to other people within the Australian context. So we're talking about a very small cohort of people who take that step, who see violence as being a logical and justified action to take.
Is it for what? Because our social tolerance is high, or law and order and justice is like very equal level? Any particular reason for that?
I think individuals find it difficult to be violent towards other individuals as human beings, and I think there's a lot to overcome, and for someone to actually take that step, which is a pretty drastic step, to see that a fellow human being um, um, is someone who can actually be violent towards, and most human beings actually find that difficult to do. So there has to be a number of other steps that take place there.
From this marginalized side of these people, how they can enhance their social belonging? Yeah, system is doing their bit, but how they can also be a bit more proactive?
Well, there's a lot of work that's being undertaken about, first of all, I think a sense of connectedness. If you can actually work on the sense of community connectedness between individuals and communities and the broad society, then um, people are less likely to feel alienated from that broad society. So there's a number of whole of society things that are done in terms of addressing, um, say, real or perceived grievances or difficulties that people have. There are a whole lot of other economic factors, issues around employment and discrimination, which are there. But there's also, when you're thinking about people who may seem on the face of it to actually have a whole number of advantages, will still also be drawn into it, because contrary to some common assumptions, there's limited evidence of, for instance, significant links between poverty and radicalization to violent extremism in first world countries. And in Australia in particular, poverty does not seem to be a particularly significant factor. Um, However, youth unemployment, for a variety of social and other reasons, is associated with many of the vulnerabilities which to radicalization which can happen. Um, I think when one's looking at the cohort, and this is not of people who are drawn into the process of radicalization, it involves both emotional and cognitive processes. And for instance, often the case that young people who are struggling with personal issues such as social isolation, family breakdown, there may be mental health concerns or identity challenges, they can be particularly vulnerable and in need of support and feeling understood. And if they are lonely or confused or frustrated by lack of purpose and belonging, maybe a sense of emptiness in life, some people seek to fill the gap by turning to a whole lot of things, such as criminal gangs or substance abuse. And a few, and this again, I was saying it's still a relatively small number, may become susceptible and vulnerable to extremist ideologies that seem to fill the gap they may feel in their lives, and gives them, enhances a sense of identity or even social status that they seem to be lacking. So I think those are the factors that often take place.
So now I come to the next section, which is about resilience. Okay.
Yeah,
So now how we or you define resilience, and this is from an individual, community, or a system level.
number of different definitions of resilience. There's a broad definition of resilience at Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities project, and it defined resilience as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kind of chronic stress or acute shocks they experience. And I think that's is quite broad, but I think it's indicates that actually it really includes those things about survive, adapt, and grow. And adaptability is one of the key things. Um, in the history of the idea of resilience, It is, of course, initially a scientific term when you're talking about the capacity of a material to absorb energy, such as and to recover its form, like a piece of rubber or something, which when you press it, it goes back to its original form. So it has a scientific origin. It then got used in the 1970s by psychologists to mean the ability of individuals, and it had a particular focus on children to recover from trauma or crisis or cope with adversity. And one of the things that was focused on then was saying what are the both the risks and importantly the protective factors, and those protective factors were found to be neighborhoods, family and kinship networks, intergenerational supports, and mutual self-help groups. So it's a question of which individuals, in particular, which children were more resilient, depended upon those networks surrounded individuals. And I think that from that focus on individual, we actually then see a link to some of the kind of broader societal issues. So we move from individual resilience to the concept of community resilience, looking at how communities are better able to manage adversity, uncertainty or disruption.
So, how governments strategize to build trust within the community?
Hmm. I think one of the key things to recognize that trust is the glue that holds society together. And one of the problems that we have, not only in Australia, but around the world, is a decline of trust in governments and the institutions of civil society. When we look at trust and what brings about a relationship of trust, is to recognize that trust is built or broken through behaviors as well as policies and processes. And governments can actually take action which can maintain or repair relationships of trust. I think the first thing to do is to recognize the reciprocal nature of trust, is that governments need to show trust in communities if they want communities to show trust in them. And one of the elements that we have seen in our research is that communities frequently want a degree of agency or freedom of movement in terms of implementing policy rather than having top-down decisions forced upon them. And I think that there are some areas in government policy, and one sees this in particular in many areas of public health, where government agencies work very closely with communities to co-produce solutions to problems. But where a decision is made and implemented without a degree of acceptance by a community, it's less able to produce it. So I think that one of the things we focus on in some of our reports is that trust building should be actually seen as a trade craft for government officials. It's a skill that officials can be trained in, so that they learn better how to build and sustain relationships with diverse communities, how to engage with vulnerability and empathy, and also understand how institutional power shapes trust dynamics, that the unequal power between governments and communities can sometimes mean that relationships of trust are difficult to produce. As I mentioned before, there are successful examples of co-design and co-production by governments within Australia, which have worked really well, in which uh, both the governments and communities are actually agree upon what needs to be done, and it comes together. But it does sometimes take longer. You have to, as one person said, you have to move at the speed of trust. And if a government agency simply says we've got to deliver this in 6 months, and kind of crash through or crash approach, it will sometimes make that trusting relationship more difficult to sustain. So there are definite ways in which things can be done, and looking at the behaviors and processes by government agencies and officials is one of the key things to consider.
And then, what is the meaning for institution to become resilient and inclusive, and especially in this polarized, digital-driven society?
Well, I think when we talk about resilience, there are a number of different ways that people focus on resilience. I think one of the things is seeing the community in as a unit in itself, and how a community can show resilience in the face of community challenges, in the face of adverse events. And when we look at those types of adverse events, a lot of the focus in Australia and around the world has been on what's been called disaster resilience. And the focus on that is that disasters, whether it's a fire or a flood or a cyclone or an earthquake, or is clearly one of the biggest types of adverse events that a community is going to deal with. And a lot of focus, a lot of the work and study on this topic has been looked at how to build community resilience before disaster strikes. And one of the key things which has been focused on is building the self-confidence of local communities, and to really focus on the local level. While people often use the phrase, national resilience or something like that as a much broader concept, a nation is only as resilient as the resilient of its individual communities. And so a lot of work is done within government and by non-government organizations and local government, and indeed, most importantly, by communities themselves, around building their own networks and connections, understanding the risks that they face, and how to manage those risks. And should disasters strike, or should an adverse event come about, how to adapt in a way that actually allows them to continue to function. I think one of the key words in resilience, in however one wants to use it, whether it's organizational resilience or community resilience and even ecological resilience, one of the key words is adaptation. It's not about staying the same. It's actually about adapting to a new set of circumstances and continuing to function.
So, like government or the community, it's all, yes, there are certain infrastructure is necessary, but there are many things come from the mindset, like how I will tackle these situations and stuff. So this is
Mm,
also helps to build up the resilience side of
yeah.
things.
And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, in countries such as New Zealand or Japan, which have many earthquakes, there will be, for instance, many community exercises to prepare for an earthquake or a disaster, so that people actually have that understanding of the risk and know what to do, and there's a sense of connection between community members, and that's an example of where people are building resilience to these potential harms.
As I am first generation immigrant, so I would like to know about this, how these policies or politics, let's say, of migration evolved in Australia. What is the politics or the policies behind this migration? Let's say last 30 years or 40
Yeah,
years.
I think that one of the key things is that our concept of multiculturalism, foundation for multiculturalism in Australia in the 70s, which was bipartisan. Um, it has largely remained bipartisan, and it varies in different parts of Australia. So within Victoria, there has been a significant degree of bipartisan support for multiculturalism, whoever happens to be in government. And I think that one of the things, and indeed Victorian legislation sets this out, is to see uh, Victoria's diversity from people from all around the world is actually an asset and a strength, and to recognize that this is in fact something that has contributed greatly to the Australia's economy, society, and culture. And that is still the view of the majority of people in Australia today, and the majority of people in our our parliament. There are, of course, some people who um, have a different view, which migration is actually a cost, and tries to portray newly arrived communities as being a burden on society, and there's a rhetoric around people coming in and taking jobs or taking housing and things like that, which is not supported by any evidence. So that is one of the challenges we have today, is that there's sometimes a narrative, as I was saying, a narrative not supported by any evidence that migration is a cost rather than an asset. When you're looking at Australia's economy overall, it is quite clear that migration is actually one of the great drivers of the economy. However, the narratives that some people have put together, often picked up from other parts of the world, are sometimes attempting to say that migrants cause all sorts of problems. And I think that this is a thing that is sometimes difficult to combat when individuals, um, and particular these days with the growth of certain aspects of social media, are wanting to uh, seek ways of driving wedges between peoples, and seeking to create polarization, will often, pick up a particular instance, and then from that particular instance say this is in fact a general pattern, where in fact there's no evidence that it's a general pattern at all. And that's one of the problems that we're having in the world today. And I think a lot of it is also um, a problem of that individuals will look at maybe what's happening in other parts of the world, and attempt to use some of the language which is being used in other parts of the world and introduce it into Australia as well, even though it's not based on actual Australian example. Now, among our major parties, there's a high degree of bipartisan support for multiculturalism and for migration. I think that the differences that arise in views actually arise um, in the fringe political parties, not in the mainstream political parties. Although there are some, individuals who seek to use polarization as a means to getting political support. My view of recent Australian elections is, in fact, that is not been a successful policy, that Australians have actually rejected that.
Do current policies respond enough to this misinformation, hate speech, and online radicalization?
Well, I think Australian governments are putting a lot of effort into these issues at the moment. One of the challenges when dealing with anything online is that the online environment moves very fast, and government processes requiring authorization for messaging and counter messaging um, tend to work more slowly. So, in fact, it's actually our systems of government which clearly want to make sure that things are evidence based and well founded, um, come up against people online who don't care whether what they're saying is factually based, and will frequently invent um, so-called alternative facts to suit their purposes. So if those online have no constraints and don't care whether they have any evidence to what they say, it's sometimes difficult for people who are interested in basing things on evidence to combat that. The other key thing is are constantly appealing on the basis of emotion. Whereas people, whether in universities or government, we like to actually base what we're doing on the basis of evidence and fact. And one of the things that we have found when seeking to counter these messages is that uh, producing evidence which shows that someone's opinion is in fact is incorrect or not based on evidence is in fact not particularly persuasive for many people. Because if you come to a view on the basis of emotion, a piece of evidence that shows that your view is false, bizarrely, in some cases, actually makes people even more convinced of their own rightness. And I think that this is one of the troubles that we're having, is that we're living in as what people have called a post-truth age, that combating untruths with truth is sometimes not effective. And I think that this is one of the key things that we have to look at, is that you have to find a way of which is different to many of the kind of the highly intellectual ways that we deal with these issues. And I think that's one of the challenges for us.
This is the first time I kind of interviewed a person like you who are actually working on these fields. So thank you very much for your wisdom.
Fine.